What is technocracy? So here we go. In the 1930s, Howard Scott, a man in the United States, came up with a movement called technocracy. This movement became a company. It was incorporated. It also existed in Canada. I'll briefly go over that as well. The idea here is that machines would take over bureaucratic and political structures, completely replacing them. The people who would replace them, nothing but scientists and mathematicians who were fully qualified and academically justified to make decisions for the entirety of nations. Why? Because the technocratic movement believed that humans are essentially just animals or machine systems to kind of balance everything out. Animals are also just machine systems. Therefore, the conclusion is all things are machine systems. As such, a machine system is a closed box of energy input and energy output. These things can be calculated and quantified using mathematical and scientific processes. As a result, the entirety of your lifehood could be calculated as a result of the energy production that you yourself can produce. The technocratic movement then decided in the 1930s that it might be a good idea to replace the existing political system and create a bloodless revolution where machines take over everything and make decisions, including the concept of this, handing out energy bucks. Energy bucks are the equivalent of $20,000 a year, which is the average person's energy output over the course of their lifetime. These energy bucks are a lot like Bitcoin, just a little bit different, in that they are tracked and sold only to you. They belong only to you, and there's some kind of identifying mechanism which they did not get. The technocratic movement didn't give details as to how this works, but the idea would be that these energy bucks only belong to you, which means you could not hoard resources. You could not pass on the things that you earned to your children. They could not inherit them. It would mean the elimination of political instability. It would mean the elimination of, at the time, the economic instability from the First World War. They were going through a Great Depression. You would just remove economic structures entirely. You wouldn't need them. There are no more actual currency dollars. It's now energy dollars. And you would remove crime as well, because how is somebody going to steal your energy bucks? They only belong to you, and somehow, through some unknown method, they're only going to be usable by you. Now, the idea here is that the technocratic movement believed in machines quite heavily. And you might note that there are some very, very big overlaps between the technocratic beliefs at the time and the beliefs that we see with AI systems today. For example, the photocell gives a brain to machines. Where have we heard this before? And indeed, we say that about AI. And we say that AI is at the very least kind of a pseudo brain replica machine. And the concept here is that at the time, these machines were going to completely replace everything that humans did, and that humans would be assistive to machines, not really the other way around. Where have we seen and heard this before? On top of that, they made the case that machines work 24/7. They do not need to eat. They do not need to poop. They do not need to pee. They do not need to rest. They do not need water. They can continue forever and ever endlessly in order to provide abundance in energy production to the entirety of humankind. And the people at the top who would operate these machines would be qualified, purely mathematical and scientific people of different degrees, not bureaucracies and politicians. This was played out, we went over this on the stream yesterday, with the project CyberSyn in Chile. I don't know. In any case, if we go down here, let's see if we can find the actual images here. I had the actual images. Here we go. This is an actual image of this technocratic movement, which was called socialist cybernetics. It was kind of revamped, and we're going to go into how it got revamped and how feminism got wrapped into it and how socialism got wrapped into it and how communism got wrapped into it and how fascism got wrapped into it. And so the best only cares about the rat. I just went over how the rat, whatever. I don't give a shit. Okay. So Chile tried to implement this. And this is an actual control room that they had. It was a very real control room. They created a thing called telex across Chile, which was kind of a internet precursor. And through this system, they were able to transmit large amounts of information through to the entirety of the nation. And their production output went through the roof. They made a bunch of money. Unfortunately, they could not deal with the human factor, and they couldn't deal with the fact that there was too much information to be processed at any given time due to simply through sheer amount of information centralized here. And, a bunch of other things were happening at the same time where workers were being overlooked by the system. They were unhappy. There was already a bit of unrest with the current Socialist Party, yada, yada, yada. We went over this yesterday. And so this is kind of what this leads into, which is the idea of technocracy and how it essentially centralizes information and machine power to top people who have a particular kind of, let's say, academic leaning as a replacement for the political establishment. This did not work out very well for them. Eventually, the people rose up with tanks and weapons and overthrew the government. In any case, continuing on. So with the idea of technocracy then, we have the creator, Howard Scott. Just briefly so you know, we also went over Joshua Haldeman. Joshua Haldeman was the technocratic leader in Canada, a contemporary and friend to Howard Scott. The technocratic movement, by the way, required the technate, which is a map that they considered to be eminent domain to the technocratic movement. You will note that this includes all of South America, all of North America, and Greenland. It is of interest to note that while Elon Musk was buddies with Trump in the White House, Trump was talking a lot about taking over Greenland and even making Canada the 51st state. That's very, very interesting because when Elon Musk left the White House, he stopped talking about it. Well, as it turns out, Joshua Haldeman, one of the leaders of the technocratic movement in Canada and a contemporary of Howard Scott, is the grandfather of Elon Musk. You can now start to see how these kinds of things begin to play out in the world. That being, ideological bends are being implemented through technological means. So we're going to now dig deeper into the idea of the technocratic movement. We start with about the 1930s here to the 1940s with the lead up to the Second World War. And the idea here is that the technocratic movement essentially promotes using machines as replacement for humans or as assistants to humans, much like we talk about today. And so the programming aspects and all of that was starting to become far more widespread, as machines were also becoming far more widespread. The technocratic movement starts changing, and it starts turning into what's called cybernetics, much like we've talked about with the Chilean government attempting to use technology to make an impact on their governmental systems. We start with a man named Norbert Wiener, who creates the cybernetic kind of definition in the early 1940s, 1950s, etc. And it builds up in the 1960s. He becomes far more popular. He starts off with this book called God and Golem. And in this book, this is where he defines human use of human beings. And this is where he defines the idea of cybernetics. And in this book, what he talks about is the concept of humans using machines which use humans. So it's like a cyclical feedback thing. And he describes it this way, which we can see play out today. So right here, okay, this is how we start the entry point into these thoughts in the world at the time with the technocratic cybernetic movement. We ordinarily think of a message as sent from human being to human being. This need not be the case at all. If being lazy, instead of getting out of bed in the morning, I press a button which turns on the heat, closes the window, and starts an electric heating unit under the coffee pot, I am sending messages to all these pieces of apparatus. If, on the other hand, the electric egg boiler starts a whistle going after a certain number of minutes, it is sending me a message. If the thermostat records that the room is too warm and turns off the oil burner, the message may be said to be a method of control of the oil burner. Control, in other words, is nothing but the sending of messages which effectively change the behavior of the recipient. What this essentially reduces down to is the concept of humans not being very different from animals, just simply having the ability to internalize feelings. Ultimately, machines, humans, and animals behave the same way. They send messages to each other, and they attempt to exert control over each other through the use of these messages. And this book touches upon how humans will use machines to send messages to other humans, which then control those other humans. Does that sound familiar? He continues with the idea that the cybernetics is the art of piloting or steersmanship, which is essentially governing a machine. Now, in the book that I should have brought up secondarily and screwed up on page 29, down there, right here, he then continues on the line of cybernetics and he goes, man makes man in his own image. This seems to be the echo or the prototype of the act of creation, by which God is supposed to have made man in his image. Can something similar occur in the less complicated and perhaps more understandable case of the non-living systems that we call machine? What is the image of a machine? Can this image, as embodied in one machine, bring a machine of a general sort, not yet committed to a particular specific identity, to reproduce the original machine, either absolutely or under some change that may be construed as a variation? Can the new and varied machine itself act as an archetype, even as to its own departures from its own archetypal pattern? He says essentially that man can be like God, where machine can reproduce human-like activities in their own image. That's right. That's what I wanted to gather out of that paragraph. So essentially, using the machine-based, systems, you can create gods out of humans by having humans create machines that are like humans. And so you can start to see where the cybernetic movement essentially goes toward. Now, in the meantime, let me pull up the next one here. In the meantime, with regards to the technocratic movement moving forward, we have this man, Richard Tolman, who is a contemporary of the books, the Wiener books that we just read, and also Howard Scott and the technocratic movement. And he was a co-founder of the Technical Alliance in 1919, which was the technocratic movement before it became known as the technocracy movement. Now, Tolman was actually a very well-known, well, before I pop this open, he was a very well-respected scientist. He was a mathematical physicist and physical chemist. He made many contributions to statistical mechanics and theoretical cosmology. He was a professor at the California Institute of Technology. As it turns out, not only was he very well known for his work in the scientific field, I'll see if I can properly pull up the image here. I don't know if this will work, but in here, in this image, it's hard to read it. I had to go find a different link, and I can't seem to find it right now. But essentially in this image, Here is Tolman on the left. Here is Einstein in the middle. And here is Howard Scott on the right, the founder of the technocratic movement. Tolman here is having a conversation with Einstein, and in the subtext down here, which I know you can't read, but I've read it. You're just gonna have to source trust me, bro. You can also find this online yourself. Tolman apparently was talking to Einstein about the technocratic movement, to which Einstein was very, very interested. So we can see now that these kinds of ideas are sparking up in a variety of different ways, and they're being spread throughout the deep, deep recesses of the scientific community in a variety of different ways. Now, let me pull up this book. The cybernetic movement then continues past the 1940s, the 1950s, etc., and becomes kind of like a second wave version of itself. And in the second wave version of itself, this is the second edition, essentially what this book goes over is the self-organization. If we just look for maybe organize, I can't remember exactly where it is in here, but there is this intent where these systems will start to self-regulate and self-organize, much like the human brain does. And so you can see control communication in the animal and the machine, because essentially animals and machines were seen as not very different from each other. Okay? So this continues to spread. Wiener, let's just have a look at who Norbert Wiener was, since we're talking about him quite a bit. Here we go. He was an American computer scientist, mathematician, and philosopher. He worked at MIT, and he came up with all kinds of useful things in the scientific community around neuroscience, philosophy. He worked a lot with John von Neumann. John von Neumann was also a very popular scientist. You may have even heard of him, involving quantum physics, game theory. I mean, this guy, I believe von Neumann was even involved with the Manhattan Project, if I remember correctly. But you can see kind of how these people interrelated and worked together, and the ideas here between cybernetics and technocracy, and machines not being so very different from animals and humans, and then the idea of humans affecting each other and manipulating each other through machines, even at the time of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, was a very prominent and, very well-known topic discussed in the scientific community. Now, while this was continuing, just give me a sec here. I got to pull up. Okay, that one. While this was continuing, around the 1960s, the idea of cyborgs came to be a thing, and this kind of this was kind of an offshoot of the cybernetic movement. Klein and Klein's, American and Austrian, come up with the idea of a cyborg. And the idea of a cyborg is that you're going to have a biological human being integrate itself with these cybernetic, the technological elements of whatever was available at the time, whatever they could conceive of at the time. And here is an article clipping from July 1960 of Life. And this was kind of the concept behind cyborgs. And this leads into the transhumanist movement. But we'll get there. We're going to take our time. We're going to cook on it. So as a result of this kind of idea, they came up with the concept of having a cyborg and how beneficial it would be. So Klein and Klein here came up with some ideas for how you could use technology and embed it into human beings. So you could think of something like, I don't know, Neuralink. And here you have their concept of what would happen if you put in a cyborg pump to the tail of a rat. It would feed chemicals at a slow, controlled rate into cyborg bloodstreams. It is now being used in cancer work to give drugs to mice, according to the article at the time. It is driven by osmosis, the diffusion of liquids through a membrane. So this concept of merging humans with technology so that they would be essentially become indistinguishable from each other. They would become interdependent to each other, is not a new concept. AI is just bringing it to the forefront again in this day and age, but it is definitely not a new project or a new concept. It has existed, again, almost since the 1930s. And you can see one of the kind of long-term, let me zoom out a bit, one of the long-term viewpoints on how they envisioned man, biological man, merging with a machine based on these kinds of articles. And so they would have, you'd carry a battery pack. It would be supplying electric power. You'd have a heart, a food synthesizer. You'd have a replaceable liver. You'd have some thin overalls. You'd have a computer brain. You'd have a chemical plant that regenerates blood by direct circulation from the heart. You would have some collapsed lungs. You'd have a replaceable kidney, etc. You'd have camera eyes. You'd have gravity boots. And so this is kind of what people thought about, especially in the academic scientific community. This is how they envisioned the merging of man and machine in the 1960s. And they were hoping that they could send these cyborgs out to space. And here's some kind of like, future-looking ideas. You'd have an atom chaser, whatever these things are, an optical video sensor connected to optic nerve. You'd have some self-regenerating atomic batteries. You'd have an accessory venous pump. You'd be dehumanized and drugged. How could you still think of him as a human when he's mostly machine with a few biological parts for the purposes of accomplishing the goal of this transhumanist idea so that we can all benefit from sending these people to space or whatever, etc., 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 etc. You can see how these kinds of things kind of came up into the ethos of the academic and scientific sphere. Klein and Klein, by the way, were not just like these, fiction author writers. They were scientists. All right. And they specialized in these kinds of, technical, you would call it technical science at the time. They worked on like tape. They show off tape from computers which predicted a man's pulse rate from his breath rate. Wiggly lines show left to right breath rate, the actual pulse rate, the predicted pulse rate. You can see that this is the kind of stuff they worked on. These are academic credentialed scientists who were thinking of concepts like this and this, merging man with machine, because in a lot of ways, the people in this field, I don't know if Klein and Klein in particular, but just as a general, concept, as we're about to get into, began to kind of lose sight of the distinction between what makes a human and what makes a machine and how they operate with each other, against each other, and so on. So as we continue, we're not going to go into the first chatbot that was ever created. And the reason why I'm covering all of this, I'm ignoring chat, by the way. The reason why I'm covering all of this is because you have to understand that the entirety of the tech industry has a long history of operating in the way that it does now. And again, I just want to bring out that there is definitely some ideological aspects at play which have infected the scientific, academic, and technical procedures of how we got here today many, many years ago, when we were all but spermazoids in our dad's spermazoid, who was also a spermazoid in his dad's balls, free of microplastics, all right? Back before that was a thing. Okay, so this is from the New York Times. This is from the New York Times in 1965. Computerized typewriter leads schizoid children toward normal life by helping them to read. The idea behind this, and so what happened here is that they essentially automated the typewriter. So children, it's called the Edison Responsive Environment Learning System. Children from 5 years old upwards spent up to a 5-month period without any formal instruction from teachers. And again, remember, this is 1965, and they would sit in front of this automated typewriter, and then they would type stuff out, or the typewriter would talk to the student. And here, let's just have a little read. The computerized typewriter allows its users to explore freely. It has infinite patience. There are no punishments when a wrong key is punched. There is no competition. It has inflexible logic. This is really important. I just want to point this out, that the logic behind this thing was inflexible indeed. It never varies. It never makes a mistake. The machine consists of a computer about the size of a small upright piano with a typewriter keyboard in front. It has a speaker and a frame above the typewriter for printed matter. The first thing a child does is press one of these standard typewriter keys. This prints the character in large type. At the same type, a soft voice automatically identifies it through the speaker. The computer can be programmed vocally and visually, or both together. When a letter is selected by a recorded voice, all the remaining keys are locked. The machine waits indefinitely while the child punches away until the right key is hit before it automatically calls the next one. In other words, the child could not get it wrong. If this automated typewriter, told the child that you have to press this key, all other keys are locked. The child would just work through it until it hit the right key, and then Bob's your uncle. Then letters lead to words, and words to sentences, and sentences lead to stories. And this was actually practiced in hospitals. And you know what? As a result of this extremely constrained logic, this automated chatbot via typewriter machine, kids actually saw some positive impacts using this machine. You could not make a mistake, for example. You were very funneled into a specific kind of writing procedure, which helped these children who usually suffered from schizophrenia to kind of hone in on what they were capable and not capable of doing, and kind of reconstruct thoughts that were important to them. And it was good. It was a good thing. Keep this in mind, because again, I just want to emphasize that the entire, AI chatbot thing as like having benefits is not the first time. This isn't novel and new. We have done this before in the form of automated typewriters. And here, I'll show you just a little brief thing here. If I go and open up this PDF here, we have this PDF. And it goes into a lot of detail with regards to the talking typewriter, as they call it. And I won't read this entire thing; it's quite long. You get the point. But there's just some interesting pictures. I just want you guys to see how it operated. You have the audio output up here. Here, I'll zoom in even more. There's some audio output over here. There's the keys down here. There's a little bit of a display, I believe, over here. There's the typewriter getting fed, and you could hear and talk and communicate and so on, right? The first chatbot in 1965. Now, let's continue. So again, this is all to kind of give you the sense of how the technocratic movement led into, the expansion of these kinds of technologies, replacing the concept of actual humans. Now, in this case, this is a good thing, right? This is good. There's nothing wrong with this. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this. What I'm saying is that these things that we have today absolutely existed before you and I did. Most likely. Here's another one. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this one, but this is the General Electric walking truck. I'm going to pull open a video. I'm not going to play the audio. And so here it is. This is from the 1960s, I believe early 1960s, and we're going to see it here. Let me just make sure that I'm not going to pop open anything weird. No, looks fine. Here, so we'll pop it open, and here we're going to have a look at how this thing operated. Okay, these are the kinds of things that existed. Again, this is with regards to the merging of man and machine. You can see how this kind of machine, look at that, 1960s. And so when you think of like those robots that you see now in the commercials where people are like kicking them all the time, I can't remember what the name of the company is, and they generate these robots that like learn how to walk and, etc. And people keep kicking them down. They keep getting back up. Here you have the first implementation via General Electric for the U.S. Army. This was bought and paid for by the US Army. This was happening in the 1960s. There you go. So you can kind of see the concept here, which is that the entire academic, scientific, and technical movement started to try and play around with the concept of merging man with machine, the transhumanist movement at play, where these machines would do way better than any human could do alone, or together they would do way better than most. Look at that. It's kicking. Look at this. Look at how insane this is. This is crazy. Absolutely crazy. Look at the precision here. And I want you to think about now what you've seen typically from these AI robotic systems in commercials and whatnot in the current day and age. Look at all that. That's crazy. Okay, so you guys get the point, right? You guys get the point. This is very cool. I don't think it shows like anything else in particular. Oh yeah, this is kind of cool. Check this out. I don't know if they show it, but crush it. Come on, crush it. It doesn't show it. In any case, you get the point, right? And so that was going on. So General Electric around the 60s was doing it. Now Raytheon, have you heard of Raytheon? Raytheon was also participating in these kinds of movements around the 60s. Raytheon created the machine that mimics the brain. They called it the Cybertron. And so here you have one of the first AI systems, but we're going to get into the actual first one. But here you have the Cybertron created by Raytheon. If you know who Raytheon is, when you know, you know. So what they did was they attempted to recreate the brain. And in the, 1961, I just want to point the date out, okay? In 1961, they started looking at how they might be able to duplicate the neural networks of the human brain, but they didn't quite go that far. Instead, what they did was they replicated the human learning process, experience, trial and error, correlation of new facts with past experiences. And they created a machine that mimics very much the style of AI machines that we have today, which is reinforcement learning through positive rewards, thumbs up, thumbs down. And they even had this machine offload decisions that were considered approved into a separate memory bank, so that the processing machine, the entire AI machine, could continue to be used in repetition without having it like layer memory upon memory upon memory. Think of it as like an external hard drive to the decisions that it already came out with as good decisions. And then it would just go back and reference those good decisions, forgetting the way that it learned how to make that good decision via the human, feedback loop. And then it would just, bring that back in when it needed to, creating like a cross-reference DB, of when it needs to make a subsequent decision. Have I already made this decision before? Have I made a related decision? Let me go back and look at my external hard drive, etc., etc. So Raytheon was working on this. We also have, let me go down to here. We also have John McCarthy. John McCarthy, some of you might recognize the name. He was around during the time when these systems were being built, and he created one of the first AI systems based on Lisp. And the reason why he created in particular Lisp and then ALGOL is because he was working on AI systems. He received accolades for his work on AI systems as part of Lisp. He would look at primitive recursive functions, for example, functional programming with lambda calculus, etc., etc., garbage collection, automatic memory management to solve problems in Lisp. And all of these things contributed to the AI movement at the time. He himself was also, for what it's worth, he was an atheist and a communist, raised as a communist rather, and then later became a conservative Republican, and talked about the mental qualities, ascribing mental qualities to machines, which we've seen today. We've covered scientific articles where there are warnings about anthropomorphizing these AI systems. And he kind of went a little bit, he kind of took it to the next level at the time. He said machines as simple as thermostats can be said to have beliefs, And having belief seems to be a characteristic of most machines capable of problem-solving performance. And there we have the anthropomorphization of these AI systems, from someone like John McCarthy. Now, let me pull up the next one. We covered that. We covered the GE thing. Okay, now we have Lewis Mumford. Who is Lewis Mumford? Lewis Mumford, around this time, was a sociologist, historian, philosopher of technology, and literary critic. And he published an article about how cybernetics could overcome disobedient humans. But he kind of did it as a warning sign. He was kind of very negative against the technocratic cybernetic movement, and he was kind of sending out warning signals, much like I do here on these streams to you guys today. And his warning signal was the following. Here we have an article from 1964 from Lewis Mumford, and here this paragraph, let me zoom in nice and tight. Through mechanization, automation, cybernetic direction, this authoritarian technics has at last successfully overcome its most serious weakness, its original dependence upon resistant, sometimes actively disobedient servo mechanisms, still human enough to harbor purposes that do not always coincide with those of the system. These servo mechanisms was his way of talking about machines that either mimicked human style, like human belief systems, or humans in and of themselves, because he was attacking it from the beliefs of these cybernetic technocrats who believed that these servo mechanisms were really no different than humans, and we should treat humans as such. And so from an internal critique point of view, he was saying, well, it looks like they figured out how to control humans, and by extension too, how to control machines. It's actually backwards. Once you know how to control machines, you know how to control humans, which goes back to the reason why I brought up Wiener's books at the beginning, where the signal of a machine controls a human. When the teapot, whistles, a human goes, "Up, I better do this thing." Who created the teapot? A human. And so the human creates the machine that controls the human. Okay. So these ideas were playing around. And while these things were playing around, the U.S. Army was, like we said with General Electric there, the U.S. Army was no stranger to the concept of artificial intelligence in the form that we would recognize it today. And what do I mean by this? Well, Cornell University has an article here. Check this out. Frank Rosenblatt works on the electronic profile analyzing computer, a precursor to the perceptron. What is the perceptron? In July 1958, the U.S. Office of Naval Research unveiled a remarkable invention. An IBM 704, a 5-ton computer the size of a room, was fed a series of punch cards. After 50 trials, the computer taught itself to distinguish cards marked on the left from cards marked on the right. Yes, the U.S. Navy had this IBM machine that could make a determination of cards based on visual perception. That's why it was called the perceptron. The first machine which is capable of having an original idea. Have we heard this before? Have we heard it before with AI? Oh yes, it creates novel ideas all the time. Well, apparently so did the perceptron in the 1950s. Where did that go? At the time, Rosenblatt, who later became an associate professor of neurobiology and behavior in Cornell's Division of Biological Sciences, was a research psychologist and project engineer at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo, New York. He was fascinated by machines that acted like humans, and so he began looking into it. His background in psychology helped shape his artificial intelligence research because he had the notion of how brains kind of like interacted with the stuff around them via his psychological background. And so he creates the perceptron. Okay. Now, the idea behind this is that it would mimic the organization of a biological brain. Gee, where have we heard this before? Have we heard the idea of an AI system mimicking the biology of a brain? Once more, this is not new. This has been around for a very long time. Continuing on, he builds the perceptron. Here he is working on the perceptron, right? And so we can kind of, let me see if I can zoom. I don't think I can zoom in properly, but in any case. And as he continues building the perceptron, so here is Frank Rosenblatt and Charles Reitman work on the unit that became the first perceptron in December 1958. I just want to see if we can open up. Yeah, here we go. And here they are working on it. Look at this, right? This is the first part of the perceptron, and the first real AI system. Now, this leads to Minsky. Minsky here, if you don't know who Marvin Minsky is, he was an MIT professor whose research into neural networks left him deeply skeptical of Rosenblatt's claims. They were kind of at odds with each other, and then they worked together. And then what happened to Minsky? Well, who is Marvin Minsky? Marvin Minsky was an American cognitive and computer scientist concerned largely with research in artificial intelligence. He co-founded the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's AI Laboratory and wrote extensively about AI and philosophy. He is considered the father of AI because his work with Frank Rosenblatt and the perceptron basically set the ground for the academic, scientific, and technical rigor that is used for creating AI systems today. He won the Turing Award. He's one of the most cited, well-known people in the AI community, so on and so forth. So again, I'm laying the groundwork here for how these things operated in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and how they have an impact today. 2020s, they're going to have an impact in the 2030s, and so on. We're talking an almost generational gap. And these ideas are still playing out before our very eyes. And if you're a programmer out there, like it or not, one way or another, you're participating in what is a long history, in terms of life, a person's life of these kinds of systems. Okay, now, let's see, we've covered that. We covered Mumford, we've covered the perceptron, we've covered Marvin Minsky. Okay, and then as one of the final things here that's going on at the time, we have the creation of ARPANET. Now, you might kind of recognize the word ARPA without the D in front of it. And yes, there is a relation there, but we're not getting into that in this stream. There's actually quite a few threads I'm pulling here, and I'm jumping around from people to people and topic to topic because these are the foundational starting points of these threads. And once you start pulling on one of these threads, it goes, I'm not kidding, bro. I slept like 4 hours last night. I read probably 300 to 400 pages of just dense articles, studies, maybe more actually, over the last 24 hours. I'm tired. This stuff is deep, and it's going to be a slow burn. You know how I do here. So in any case, so we have ARPANET here. It is the U.S. Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. It was the first public packet-switched computer network. It was first used in 1969 and decommissioned in 1989. Many of the protocols used by computer networks today were developed for ARPANET, and it is considered the forerunner of the modern internet. So this is what I mean when I talk about the concept of these kinds of systems having existed for a very long time and in a variety of different ways in academic and scientific fields, including, for example, governmental, federal, military, scientific, social, psychological, mathematical. Einstein was, at least on the outskirts of technocracy when it was around. When it was around. All of these things, kind of spread, and people's ideas of what would happen. Books were born out of this. Ideas were born out of this. Literal AI systems were born out of this, based on the capability of hardware at the time. The internet was born out of this, because how on earth are you going to create a technocracy unless you create the internet? A technocratic movement cannot exist without the internet, because you need the mass traversal of information across entire nations, especially if you look at, for example, the TechNate map here. How would you spread information to Greenland, when Elon was pushing Musk to take over Greenland because Musk's grandfather was in the technocratic movement? Come on, how dumb do you think we are? Of course, you would need the internet at the time in the 1930s to 50s when this kind of map was being generated. Of course, you would need something like ARPANET to exist. Of course, you would need cyborgs to exist. Of course, you would need to kind of blur the lines between what makes a human, what makes an animal, what makes a machine. These things would have to be blurred necessarily. Otherwise, the entire concept of energy input and output in a closed box system doesn't make sense. You can't have manipulation of people. You can't have subservient people. You take note of the Chilean, government thing that we went over yesterday, where the people uprise and they take tanks and weapons and other things, and they can overthrow the government regardless of how well the technocracy is implemented. Yada yada yada. All of these things had to take place. You can see how they offshoot off of each other, and maybe the people who created ARPANET may not have been involved in technocracy. I most certainly cannot find any evidence of this, but what I am pointing to is that these ideas begin to spread within these communities, and they spawn branches, and we get to where we are today. Now, what the hell does this have to do with... What on earth are you talking about, Spira? Margaret Mead. Okay. Who is Margaret Mead? Oh boy. Oh boy. Margaret Mead was an American cultural anthropologist, author, and speaker who appeared frequently in the mass media during the 1960s and 1970s. She earned her bachelor's degree at Barnard College of Columbia University and her MA and PhD degrees from Columbia. Mead served as the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Mead was a communicator of anthropology in modern America and Western culture, and was often controversial as an academic. Here she is, her reports detailing the attitudes towards sex in South Pacific and Southeast Asian traditional cultures influenced the 1960s sexual revolution. She was a proponent of broadening sexual conventions within the context of Western cultural traditions. But Spiro, what the ever-living fuck does this have to do with tech? Let's pause for a moment, shall we? Let me pull up the links here. First of all, just a little insight into the time before she became very popular. This is from a book she wrote called The South Seas. And she says the following: "We are at a crossroads and must decide." This is from like 1930s, very early 1939. "We are at a crossroads and must decide whether we go forward towards a more ordered heterogeneity or make a frightened retreat to some single standard which will waste 9/10 of the potentialities of the human race in order that we may have a too dearly purchased security. We have an opportunity to conceive, and out of that conception begin to build a world which shall be as new in the ordered interplay given to man's myriad gifts as the present world is new in the technological utilization of physical resources. The imminence of other problems, the need to find some general solution for the problems of poverty and war, should not blind us to the importance of building a world which is not only safe in terms of obtaining a living and safe against meaningless aggression, but also safe from the ever-present danger that one version of life, a version which uses only a tithe of human capabilities, will be forced upon everyone. If we solve our economic and international problems with sophistication, but compromise that solution by attaching it to an oversimplified and naive view of personality and culture, we hamstring the future. But if we hold before us as a goal a world in which each gift will have its place, we may be able to make the necessary social inventions to construct a world of interrelated and integrated values which will replace both the homogeneity of the savage and the confused and frustrating heterogeneity of the 20th century. Let's pull the next book. Later on, she writes kind of towards the end of her life, maybe kind of midway, I should say, around the 1972. Let me just do here. Let me do this proper here. Maybe I should pull it out I'll pull it out in a different. One sec. I got to do this correct. Otherwise, it's not going to work properly for you guys. Let me do this correct. So if I do this, and then I pull out. She has a book. It's called Blackberry Winter, and it's kind of a autobiography of her own life, much after she became very popular. And we're about to find out how popular and how well embedded she became in different communities that would have a wide-reaching impact into our lives today. So let me do this over here. Let me see if this will work here. So here we have Margaret Mead. Here she is, and her Blackberry Winter, My Earlier Years. Now, does anybody remember, out of curiosity, who the creator of, let's go up to the top here. Who is the creator of this movement, the technocratic movement? Howard Scott. Howard Scott was the creator of the technocratic movement. Now, interesting, we find that she knew Howard Scott. As a matter of fact, she knew and was very close friends with someone who Howard Scott had a very romantic relationship with. Now, if we look, let me just look up the word Howard. He shows up several times in this book. We're gonna tackle exactly one. Okay. So here we go. Let me do a full screen here. One of my troubled friends, Eleanor Steele, who was by her own rights quite popular among socialist movements, I believe, who was beautiful and amiable and also vulnerable because she was so pliant to other people's wishes. Just out of college, she had fallen in love with Howard Scott, the magnetic founder of technocracy. Howard was married, or so we believed. Later, we learned how easy it was for people to make up stories about Howard. In any event, we believed that Howard had a wife, and he did have a mistress, an actress whom he saw perform in a magnificent presentation of King Lear. And then there was Eleanor. So it seems like Howard kind of, he got it, Howard, admittedly, was a very tall man, more than 6 feet tall. I believe that's what she describes in this book, as a matter of fact. And he had a very kind of enigmatic, charismatic personality. The problem with Howard Scott, as described by Margaret Mead here, is that when it came time for him to represent his technocratic views, he had a problem expressing them properly, and so people mistook his views for something they were not. And so Margaret Mead here ends up having some one-on-one conversations with Howard Scott, the founder of the technocratic movement, where she begins to understand his views, and she even begins to repeat them in this autobiography, where she says things like, we need to organize consumption, we need to use modern techniques, modern machinery. Howard is misunderstood. We became close friends. He explained it to me a lot of times. He started to receive criticism, and I don't know where this criticism came from. Part of it was because he could not. So I think, where was it? He gave miserable speeches. He couldn't advocate for himself properly. That's right about here, right? And so as a result, she had to kind of internalize the arguments that Howard Scott made with regards to the technocratic movement. Okay, all right. So Margaret Mead becomes very, 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 very involved and then starts repeating the belief systems of the technocratic movement because she very much believes them. Why would Margaret Mead believe a movement like this? What would possibly, pull someone like Margaret Mead into this kind of a system? Well, hang on, I just got to pull the right thing here. I'm going to close this We're going to go back to the end here. When we go have a look at her Wikipedia again, now let's keep reading. So, as we continue through her life story, we get to the point where in her personal life, around the 20s, she went to Samoa and she did a psychological study on the Samoan people there. And what she took away from that study, which let's pull up the study itself. This is a kind of like a meta-analysis of that study, Coming of Age, but Not in Samoa, Reflections on Margaret Mead's Legacy for Western Liberal Feminism. She decided that for some reason or another, and she was vehemently opposed for this study, at least to some degree, she somehow came to the conclusion that these Samoan women in this Samoan village or nation or whatever it was, were essentially treated in a particular way that promoted feminist ideology. This was at a time when feminism was going through its second wave. And she took this study and she, according to some people, misrepresented her study results and said, well, look at the Samoan people here and how they treat their woman. And there's a benefit to the matriarchal, ultimate matriarchal position, or at the very least, the feminist movement itself. And so now we go into the 30s, and she begins to look at Howard Scott. And now what I want you to do is, for but a moment, I beg of you, to think back on all the articles that I just went over, because I know some of you are going, what the fuck are you on, Spiro? I want you to go back through the articles I went over. I'm going to go back right now, and I want you to start thinking about the concept that came out of technocracy and cybernetics, that being that man can be manipulated by machine, that man can become like God, recreating machines in his own image, that there is a very real worry that machines can make man subservient to authoritarian systems, the idea of the cybernetic and technocratic elite at the top, bundled in with the benefits as you see here. Now you start to kind of see a line where man, machine, and animal, as Robert Wiener here began to propose in the cybernetic movement, they no longer are as distinct as we think they are. And even the technocratic study course, a very dense book that I have read front to back once, I could only stomach it once, goes through an entire set of scientific studies that they pull up as proof that man is really no different from animal. Their best proof? If man was moral, and morality was a fundamental aspect of man, thus differentiating them from animals, then you would not see man, who is hungry and poor, let go of their morality and steal and murder in order to take care of themselves or others. When put up against the wall, man will behave no differently than animals. And since we can define animals as a system of inputs and outputs, electrical signals in the brain through the physical body, therefore, the actual distinction between man and animals is really no different than that of man and machine. It's all electrical inputs and outputs. And now you can see where the concept of the matrix, for example, plays into this, where the concept of kind of the fluidity of people and who they are begins to play into this, and why people start looking at things like, I wonder what it would look like if we fully merged machines, Neuralink, with mankind, humans, biological. And someone like Margaret Mead, now having the means to attack the patriarchal society that exists around her, with the hierarchy that she feels, it goes against second wave feminism, with the background of her Samoan study and now the technocratic movement, whereupon she can now say, hey, so let's get into this. She can say, hey, wouldn't it be better if we had people in government who were based solely on merit? And you know what? To a degree, I absolutely agree with this concept. Whether you are a woman or a man, if you can write good code, just as an example, if you can write good code, we need you. Absolutely. I don't care if you're a man or a woman. If you can write good code by your merits, welcome aboard. Okay? However, what you start to see here is an ideological bend. In 1968, she helps to establish, with the help of others who she became buddies with, she starts to establish the cybernetic society. So she literally took her learnings from all the stuff that she got from the technocratic movement, from the cybernetic stuff that was coming out of Robert Wiener, from the scientific community, and she establishes an entire cybernetic society. She helps to establish it. She's one of the key fundamental players. She's considered one of the founders. And here she is in Atlanta making an opening speech kind of a thing, like an announcement. And the entire concept here is, hey, we can remove the structure of men. Let's remove the structure of men and let's do what the Chileans did here. I don't know if I can even... Let's do this. This is what we need to do. Where people sit in a room like this, they get funneled through a centralized form of machinery, a bunch of data, and then they make quantifiable decisions, because at the end of the day, aren't all humans machines? Aren't all humans just inputs and outputs? And you know what? If you want to have full governmental control over the entire society, well, that's really easy, because you just treat everybody as a machine. You use machines to control machines. You use data to manipulate people. This stuff not only was happening in the 60s, it played out in Chile in real life. And Margaret Mead used that to her advantage. And she bundled in. That's the difference. It's not that the idea of meritocracy or that women having merit should be completely dismissed simply because you are a woman. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is the bundling in of an ideology into the very fabric of an otherwise purely logical system. This stuff has been happening for a long, long time. And Margaret Mead was one of the first people to very, 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 very overtly and explicitly bundle in an ideological bend, although she was not the only one. And right-wing people also tried to bundle in a bunch of ideological stuff into the technological, landscape. We will get into that, I promise you. The right wing, whatever, or people who are against these kinds of ideologies are not themselves exempt from doing this. Okay? But right now, this is the kind of the thread that we're following, because there are direct connections here. I'm trying to draw direct links. Okay. So she creates the cybernetic society, right? Now, just so you know, the cybernetic society, the cybernetic movement that started with her and her buddies continues to this day. This is an event on Future Cafe, the future of cybernetics, Wednesday, October 23rd, 2019. I'm going to read this out to you, and I want you to pay attention to the verbiage. 2019. Cybernetics and cyborgs might develop in 100, 200 years. What are the applications of cybernetics? What will happen if we become cyborgs? Are we already cyborgs? Anthropologist Margaret Mead explored how cybernetics could be used to create a cross-disciplinary language for exports. I apologize, that's experts. And Donna Haraway, professor at UCSC, argues that uploading our consciousness into machine bodies, becoming cyborgs, will solve dualisms of human and animal, and machine, self and other, mind and body, and binary gender. Are you starting to see? She writes in her hailed A Cyborg Manifesto in 1991, this is a dream, not of a common language, but of a powerful, infidel heteroglossia. She declares, we can be responsible for machines. They do not dominate us or threaten us. We are responsible for boundaries. We are they. This is what has come out of Margaret Mead's cybernetic movement. Now let's go back now that we've got that, into what Margaret Mead believed in. So she had a few questionable, sexual identifications that were never confirmed. Mead never openly identified herself as lesbian or bisexual. In her writings, she proposed that it is to be expected that an individual's sexual orientation may evolve throughout life. As things continued, she had a number of different people that she was romantically attached with. And then she ends up marrying. So here we go. This is her Samoan, her Samoan study, etc. She becomes kind of like involved with people like Derek Freeman, psychological, powerhouses, people who take kind of a little bit of a few touches from her works: Pinckner, Dawkins, Ridley, etc., etc. You can see the body of her work. However, things start to get interesting, because now that in her mind she's married and she tries to use the technological and kind of like energetic input-output systems to blur the lines between what is gender, what is biology, what is a human, etc., she marries someone named, I believe, Bateson. Okay? Let's see if Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson was a cyberneticist who joined along with her in the creation of the cybernetic movement. They together worked in, let's say, quite a few things. Let me pull up this article. How Margaret Mead's research into utopias, like the technocratic utopia, helped usher in the psychedelic. Pioneering anthropologist Margaret Mead came of age in a time of enormous change and uncertainty. In the aftermath of World War I, as technologies like the radio and automobile began to take hold, Mead and her husband, Gregory Bateson, began to formulate a vision for utopia that relied upon plant-based psychedelics. They saw science as something which was responsible for some of the bad things in the world, historian Benjamin Breen says, but also as something which could be a tool for fixing the world or healing a sick society. Her specific interest in psychedelics took hold in 1930 when, doing field work on the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska, she noticed the people of the reservation were using peyote. And so down the timeline of her work, right around 1932, when Howard Scott pops up, shortly after this, technocracy, and then down the line, cyberneticism. Gregory Bateson, after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, writes a memo to the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, saying that unconventional means of warfare will predominate in the years to come. And so this idea of psychological warfare being more important than the warfare of conventional arms, that becomes really important in the Cold War. The specter of LSD being released as a gas in a subway system, for instance, that of course never comes to pass. But the idea that there's a war that can be expressed in a form of psychology, that we can fight battles through mass manipulation and through the media and through psychological techniques, I think that's very, very important to the history of the Cold War. And even in the present, we're living through it. On Mead's involvement with the Mary Circle, a group that conducted psychedelic research related to World War II. So she participated in truth drugs, and she attempted to find drugs that would be considered part of the psychological warfare umbrella in order to get people to tell the truth. They became known as the Mary Circle. By the early Cold War, about 1952, the Mary Circle was co-opted by who? The CIA, on NASA-funded programs in the 60s to teach dolphins to speak using LSD. The person at the center of this story is a guy named John C. Lilly, who Bateson, the husband, in about 1961, ends up writing to, and they become friends. Lilly invites Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead's husband, to join him at this dolphin research lab he set up with NASA funding and U.S. Navy funding in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And John C. Lilly is a physiologist. This is early neuroscience. They wanted to communicate with dolphins and whales and what is this? Cetaceans? And meanwhile, Lilly is injecting the dolphins with LSD and then himself with LSD and literally spending hours trying to talk to them. You can listen to the recordings. If you search online for the words John C. Lilly, Dolphin, LSD, Stanford, you will find many, many tape recordings of this, and he doesn't make much progress, suffice it to say. On Mead's bisexuality, she was very secretive about her sexuality. However, if you dig into her books, you can get hints that she was at the very least in some kind of fluid, gender spectrum. And she believed it to be so because she felt like genderness and, sexual attraction, whatever you want to call it, evolved as you grew older. She is remembered as a pioneer in understanding specifically the difference between gender and sexuality. And the therapy of psychedelics in the 50s helped her to come up with some of these concepts. Meanwhile, in the 60s, she is creating the cybernetics movement. Now, if you look at this person, at Margaret Mead and her husband, at the same time, working together in these different capacities, being involved with all these kinds of people, MIT, US Army, apparently the fucking CIA, all of these kinds of ideological backgrounds, because they themselves believe in it, then you can kind of see how it absolutely matches up with the belief system of the technocratic movement, because the technocratic movement provides a very, very scientific sounding delineation point between what makes a human, let alone what makes a human a female. If you can just kind of obfuscate away what makes a human, then it honestly doesn't even matter what makes a male or a female, right? At that point, who cares? And so it is at this point that we're going to put a pause on this. But what I will say is, in the Macy conferences, these are some conferences that Margaret Mead went with her husband from the 40s to the 60s. A lot of people who we would consider as foundational to technical aspects of what we do today, we already covered a few, they participated in these conferences, and Mead was extremely well known and respected at the time. If we look at some of the people who attended, let me see if I can go down and find. Yeah, here we go. So you can see people like, let's see if we can name drop a few names here. So we have her husband, obviously. We have, let's see, Howard Lid. That might be a familiar name to some people. We have, let's see here, Claude Shannon. That might be a familiar name to people. The father of the information theory. We have John von Neumann, a fundamental cornerstone of the scientific progress in terms of computer science and engineering and even some mathematical stuff. And it only continues if you look at some of the people who participated in these Macy conferences, and they were talking about things like, gee, I don't know, consideration of the effects of pharmacological agents on the overall circulation and metabolism of the brain, followed by functional organization of the brain, followed by studies of electrical activity of the brain in relation to anesthesia, etc., etc., etc. You have Stanley Cobb. Some of you might recognize him. You've got, let's see, not Freeman, not Lehrman. Who else do we have? Theodore Schwartz. No, I don't recognize anybody here, but I did recognize a few names when I went through this. So these are the people that they were hobnobbing with, hanging out with, sharing ideas with, studying the brain with, and coming up with all of these concepts that we see today with these AI systems. And that brings this episode of the technocratic movement to an end. There you go. You have a much deeper historical view into what the technocratic movement was, who was involved behind it, direct links between the ideological background behind them. And if you're paying attention to what I'm saying and what I've said in the past, hopefully you're seeing some of the links that I'm making with regards to how these things are playing out today.